Good afternoon. My name is Scott Green, and I'm the president of the University of Idaho. On behalf of our university and the Bora Foundation, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2022 Meyerhoff Lecture. It's an honor to host this event. Our partnership with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is valuable to our community, and discussions like today's are important to our collective future. Putting past atrocities in perspective is worthwhile, especially in light of current events, both around the globe and close to home. We're grateful to our sponsors who've made this event possible and appreciate everyone who has joined us online. I look forward to an enlightening discussion. Thank you for joining us.
OCO, Dylan heading nicely, Dakwadoa, Salagi Ayeli, Kayla, Galagwo, Diukno, Agiwo, Nihisti, Nihi, Iga Yidi Gla, Nista Danai, Kohi Iga, Wado. Greetings and welcome. My name is Dylan Headden Nicely. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Idaho College of Law, where I direct the University of Idaho's Native American Law program. And on behalf of our partners at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I would like to welcome you to the 2022 Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Annual Lecture, The Citizen Other, Citizenship Stripping in Nazi Germany and the United States. We look forward to a robust interdisciplinary conversation about two distinct yet intersecting histories. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The Meyerhoff Lecture is made possible through the generosity of the Meyerhoff family and is organized by the museum's Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. This program was created by one of the founders of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Chairman Emeritus of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, Harvey M. Meyerhoff, who, with his sister Eleanor Katz, endowed this lecture in 1994 in tribute to their parents' tradition of philanthropic support for Jewish learning and scholarship. The Meyerhoff Lecture honors excellence in research on the Holocaust and fosters dissemination of cutting-edge Holocaust scholarship. This year's Meyerhoff Annual Lecture is a vital part of the Mandel Center's national academic program's regional programming. By exploring the Holocaust through a variety of lenses, including local persecution histories throughout North America that persisted in the 1930s and the 1940s, the Mandel Center ensures a vital field of study that has a place in the Academy for generations to come. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is pleased to be working collaboratively with the Bora Foundation at the University of Idaho in Moscow, as well as all of our partner campuses across the Pacific Northwest on this and future programs. A special thank you to Professors Smith, Halverson, Ladino, Krotke, Crandall, and Slovic for their commitment to planning, organizing, and facilitating this discussion. As someone who is privileged to work with tribal leaders throughout the United States, I'm often reminded that the examination of history serves two important purposes. First, we honor our ancestors by remembering them and the hardships they went through to provide us with the future that we have today. Equally important, we honor our descendants by leaving a world that is better than we found it. We do that by remembering, learning, and remaining vigilant against the injustices and trauma of the past. Maya Angelou once said, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." It is in that spirit that we proceed with today's discussion and why I'm so honored to be introducing our 2022 Meyerhoff lecturers, Dr. Amanda Frost and Dr. Wolf Gruner. Dr. Amanda Frost is the Anne Loeb Bronfman Distinguished Professor of Law and Government at the American University. She writes and teaches in several fields, including, but not limited to, constitutional law, immigration and citizenship, and judicial ethics. Her scholarship is widely cited in federal and state courts, and she was invited to testify on her legal articles by the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Dr. Frost is a prolific author on topics related to her academic and non-academic research. Dr. Frost's most recent book, You Are Not American, Citizenship Stripping from Dred Scott to the Dreamers, was published in 2021 by the Beacon Press. Dr. Wolf Gruner is the Chappell Giron Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at the University of Southern California, where he is the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research and a member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Academic Committee. Dr. Gruner is a prodigious author and a leader in the field of Holocaust studies. His forthcoming work is meant for a wider, non-academic audience and focuses on forgotten acts of individual defiance and the protest and resistance of German and Austrian Jews during the Holocaust. Welcome to you both. The title of today's lecture is The Citizen Other, Citizenship Stripping in Nazi Germany and in the Pacific Northwest. Before we jump into the larger discussion, I think it might be worthwhile to back up for a moment and flesh out what we mean when we're talking about citizenship in these two very different places in the 1930s. Please also spend a couple of minutes introducing what it meant to be a citizen and what protections it could afford you. And we'll begin this part of the discussion with Dr. Frost.
Yes, so citizenship in the United States was deeply contested, especially in the beginning of US history, when, quite remarkably, the US Constitution did not define who was a citizen. And this question was very controversial in a nation divided by slavery. And particularly controversial was the status of the 500,000 free Black people and whether they were citizens. And so this question really came to the fore in the case that I'm guessing many who are listening have heard of, Dred Scott versus Sandford. So Dred and Harriet Scott, who are pictured here along with their children Eliza and Lizzie, were slaves who were brought into free territory by their owner in the 1830s. And so they filed a lawsuit in a federal court in Missouri claiming that they were free under the rule that they'd been brought to free territory and that rendered them free. But a threshold question in their case was whether they were citizens entitled to bring this lawsuit. And so the Supreme Court in 1857 issued a decision, and this case is well known for upholding slavery and expanding slavery. But it was also very significant for the fact that Chief Justice Taney, speaking for the court, said that no Black person, slave or free, could ever be a citizen of the United States. So of course, this decision came right before the Civil War, and the nation went to war over the question of slavery. But after that war was won by the North, by the free states, and slavery was abolished, the question still remained, who could be a citizen of the United States? And so the Reconstruction Congress, and what many refer to as the Second Founding, passed the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and then the 14th Amendment, the nation ratified it, which established equal protection of the law for all in the country, as well as creating birthright citizenship. So you see in front of you a slide describing the 14th Amendment, and that first sentence, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And the purpose of that provision very clearly was to end citizenship based on race and to end caste in America. And I'm happy to say that while Dred Scott passed away before the before the war and before this amendment was added to the Constitution, Harriet Scott and her children did live to see this become law and to see this overturn the decision in their case. One can also become a citizen of the United States, not just by being born on US soil, as now is protected by the Constitution, but also by naturalizing, which millions, hundreds of millions of immigrants have done over the history of the United States, as well as being born outside the United States to US citizen parents. And the rights of citizenship are essential. So in the 1930s, as today, citizens who are adults have the right to vote in all elections. They have the right to hold federal and state office. They have the right and obligation to serve on a jury. And most important of all right now is the right to enter and remain in the United States of America.
Thank you, Dr. Frost. Dr. Gruner?
Yeah, thank you. So in Germany, the question of citizenship has a very different history than in the United States. Before 1871, when the German Reich was created, the different states like Bavaria or Prussia had their own citizenship, state citizenships. This was even kept under the new German citizenship law in 1913, so that for a while, citizenships of the states and the Reich coexisted. This new law in 1913 defined the German citizenship as one which was handed down by their parents. So it is not like in the United States, a right which you get when you are born in a certain territory. So that means when you will be a German citizen, you are getting it by birth via your father. So this is always kind of handed down by males or by, for example, marriage with a German man. the rights afforded by citizenships were similar. So there was the right to vote, to hold public offices, and then also the right to be protected within the borders of the German Reich and also abroad. So how do immigrants, or how did immigrants acquire German citizenship? This was similar, but much more restricted and much more difficult in Germany. So, for example, service in the military would grant the possibility to get citizenship, or certain kind of offices which were held, or certain workplaces also opened up the opportunity to apply for naturalization. When the Nazis came to power, they unified the state and the Reich citizenship into just one German citizenship. And interesting is, just before they did, for the course of history, it was very important that these distinction between the state and the Reich citizenship existed, because Hitler, as many of you might know, was originally not a German. He was from Austria. And when he moved to Germany, to Munich, before the First World War, he pretended to be stateless, although he still had his Austrian citizenship, and later kind of left his Austrian citizenship. But he needed to acquire the German one. So several kind of, when the Nazi party kind of had their rise, several members of state governments tried to hand Hitler a state citizenship. But this was complicated. Hitler had already done a coup. He was in prison, so he was not the easiest kind of person to get a citizenship. But nevertheless, some very loyal friends made him a citizen of the small, very tiny kind of German state Braunschweig. And in February 1932, Hitler was a German citizen, just in place for big elections, which came in the same year.
Thank you very much. So the 1930s was also an important time in the history of Native American citizenship. Tribal people were not recognized as citizens in the United States until 1924, which, as Dr. Frost pointed out, was decades after birthright citizenship supposedly became the law of the land in the United States. And the history of the relationship between tribes in the United States is really complex. It has always been considered to be a government-to-government relationship, but the scope of that relationship has waxed and waned over time. Originally, tribal people were not United States citizens simply because they were considered to be citizens of their own nations. However, by the late 19th century, federal policy had shifted significantly and viewed tribal people as, quote, wards of the federal government, which provided the legal justifications for the United States to control pretty much every aspect of daily tribal life. And that's just how we get things like boarding schools, removal, concentration on unfamiliar and unusable land, neglect, forced sterilizations, adoptions, countless other assimilationist policies that took place during this time. And these policies were all 100% legal because Native American people were not afforded the protections that some US citizens took for granted, and because of this unique plenary authority that United States assumed over Indian affairs. The modern relationship between the United States and tribes formed in 1934, so right in the time period that we're talking about, with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, which is also known as the Indian New Deal. And the Indian Reorganization Act reaffirmed congressional recognition of American Indian tribes as sovereign governments and tribal people as citizens of those tribes, as well as citizens of the United States. And it's that political relationship between the United States and tribes that forms the legal basis for the modern laws that empower tribes today to develop their own economies, protect the health and welfare of their citizens, and engage in self-determination. So I wanted to dive a little bit more deeply into this first question and follow up with this. Can you both also describe how citizenship stripping was a proxy for discrimination on other grounds? And we'll start this one with Dr. Gruner.
Yeah, definitely. So while the German citizenship kind of was organized around an ethnic group, the Germans, it was not always kind of understood in the same way who is a German. And this plays out dramatically when the Nazi Party came kind of into being. They immediately started to contest and to challenge that, for example, Jewish Germans would be Germans. And in their very early program for the Nazi Party of 1920, they already kind of inscribed that Jews are only guests in Germany. Although they were born, they had German parents and everything. And then they also declared that not only they are just guests in Germany, citizens can only be Germans of German blood or Aryan blood. This also meant that only citizens who can hold public offices, this would exclude Jews from public offices. And then the next point was to also strip potentially Jews from citizenship when they had immigrated after 1914. So there were several regulations already in this very early program, which then, when the Nazis took power in 1933, they slowly started to enact. And for example, the first one is, which is the most kind of well-known one, are the Nuremberg laws enacted in September 1935. And we see here a picture which is important because the Nuremberg laws enacted by the Nazis were supposed to kind of create a citizenship, which is called the Reich citizenship, for for Aryans. This would be kind of defined on a racist basis. And this picture is important because since race didn't really exist, they had to kind of refer to the religion of the grandparents of the German citizens. And here you see these different combinations, who is a German or supposed to be a German and who is Jewish, just because the grandparents were of Jewish religion. So with the Nuremberg laws, we often think that they just stripped Jews of the German citizenship, which is not entirely true. They create a two-tier system of citizenship. One was the Reich citizen, which kept all the kind of political rights, the civil rights, while the second tier was the so-called just citizenship, which made non-Aryans, including the Jews, or most of all the Jews, to state subjects. And so to enforce these Nuremberg laws, the Nazis needed to define who is actually Jewish or non-Aryan. And that's when they kind of came up with the solution to refer to the religion of their grandparents. And later, after the Nuremberg laws, these kind of definitions were then used to also, in practical terms, but also in legal terms, to deprive Jews of other remaining rights like the protection and education and so on.
Dr. Frost?
Yes, so as I explained earlier, the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, added in 1868, was supposed to end caste in America and end the idea that citizenship and the rights of citizenship were premised on race or ethnicity or immigration status. But the story was not quite that simple. And I want to use here an example of a woman named Ethel Mackenzie, who is a perfect example of the way that citizenship stripping was used to incorporate into the US law these differential treatment based on immigration status. So Ethel Mackenzie was born in 1885 in San Francisco. So she was born a US citizen under the 14th Amendment. And when in her 20s, she caught what she called suffrage fever, and she began fighting for women's right to vote. And as we all know, women did get the right to vote in California, where she lived, even before the rest of the nation. But then when she went to cast her vote, the registrar in San Francisco said, you can't vote because you are no longer a citizen. Under a federal law enacted in 1907 that remained in place for several decades, any woman, and only a woman, who married a non-citizen automatically lost her citizenship. And Ethel Mackenzie had married a man from Scotland a few years before. So like any red-blooded American, she filed a lawsuit and took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. But she lost that decision 9-0. And the court scolded her and said, well, if you marry a non-citizen, you don't deserve to keep your citizenship, which was the same theory that Congress was acting under. And we see this law, an intersection between of course, sexism, but also xenophobia, fear of the foreigner, and the view that women could not retain their own identity if they went outside the fold and married a non-citizen. So I'm happy to say that this law was eventually overturned, in part because women gained the right to vote, gained political power, and women were elected to Congress and overturned it. But there's many other descriptions of citizenship stripping in our nation's history, many other examples, including stripping citizenship from naturalized citizens, particularly those who were labor leaders, and as I will explain more a little later, coercing Japanese Americans into giving up their citizenship during World War II.
So, as I've already alluded to, the tribal relationship with American citizenship has been a complicated relationship, to say the least. On the one hand, citizenship is an important right that leads directly to the protection of other rights in American society. But on the other hand, as a people that were already citizens of sovereign nations, something that tribal people largely did not ask for, and something that often interfered with tribal sovereignty and self-determination. And likewise, the levels of control that the United States has exerted over these groups has shifted over time. But during the late 19th and early 20th century, our time period of concern, the United States exerted nearly total control over the daily lives of tribal people up until the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, which led to all the social experiments that I've already alluded to. However, at the same time, tribal members have enjoyed unique rights that other people do not have, particularly here in the northwestern portion of the United States, as a result of that tribal citizenship. And those rights were bought and paid for through the cession of millions, if not billions, of acres of land that were repossessed to non-native settlers. Also, their political rather than racial status as citizens of federally recognized tribes is the legal basis for many contemporary federal laws that we have today that provide unique services and advantages to tribal people. So that makes me wonder, can you please discuss a little bit more about the intersection between citizenship stripping, deportation, and immigration in your respective studies? And we'll once again start with Dr. Gruner here.
Yeah, thank you. So after the Nazis took power, one of the first measures was in the Ministry of Interior to enable policies against immigration. And I already talked about this very early Nazi program, which said Jews are guests. So first targets were Jewish immigrants here. So they prepared in March 1933 legislation to revoking citizenship of naturalized Jews. So that means Jews who had immigrated earlier, mostly either before or after the First World War from Eastern Europe, like Poland. And already in July, so several months later, this law was enacted and it was called the Law of Revocation of Naturalization of the German Citizenship. And it ordered to review all new citizens or former immigrants after 1918 and to see if citizenship can be revoked. And to make this a little more kind of practical, this impacted the lives of many German Jews who had lived in Germany for decades. So they were not recent immigrants. Just to share one story, Julius Fromm, he was from Poland, but lived since 1893 in Berlin. He founded a successful rubber company. They kind of produced the first condoms in Germany. This company was founded in 1913, grew very fast, and he was one of the biggest taxpayers in Berlin. After more than 25 years, which is a pretty long time, he decided to become a German citizen, which he was granted in 1920. However, with the new law in July 1933, he was one of the first targets of this new law to revoke the citizenship. And we know about his case because he wrote a very kind of emotional and long petition to the Berlin police president to convince them to revoke citizenship. And many of the arguments he actually used was about his Germanness. And another case where this kind of connection between immigration, deportation, and citizenship plays a big role is for those Jews who fled Germany. And some of them, because they had difficulties to settle somewhere else during the first years, they decided to go back. But since they had left, they now were perceived as kind of non-citizens, although they still had citizenship, and were put in concentration camps immediately after their arrival. So they were not allowed to resettle in Germany. And then the last big step are the deportations, mass deportations, which were organized in Nazi Germany, first starting in 1938 against all of those Jews who had Polish passports. This happened in October 1938, where they were brought with buses and trains to the border of Poland. And then during the war in October 1941, even German Jews who had still citizenship were all mass in mass deportations brought to Poland, to occupied Poland. And this is what this picture shows, where German police and Gestapo are summon Jews, including, as you see, elderly Jews, and then brought them with trucks to train stations, and from there to occupied Poland, to ghettos, and later on directly to extermination camps. And you can see here, just note kind of on the top of the picture, you see that this was not a kind of a hidden endeavor. This was kind of happening in plain daylight for everybody to see.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Frost?
Yes, in the United States as well, there's always been a very close connection between immigration and questions of citizenship. So as I've mentioned now several times, in 1868, the country said, if you're born on US soil, you're a citizen, regardless of the citizenship status of your parents or your race or ethnicity or anything else. And yet 30 years later, the US government questioned that in the case of a man named Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1870. He's pictured here. I love this photo of him. This was taken right before he set off on a steamship in his 20s to visit some family in China, but he'd grown up in the United States and was born in the United States, and the United States was his home. Nonetheless, when he tried to return to the United States, the government wouldn't let him disembark from that steamship in San Francisco Bay. And they argued that he was not a citizen because, and this was a remarkable argument, they said, the children of immigrants are not citizens. That would have taken away the citizenship and disenfranchised, as well as potentially led to the deportation of hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Americans when they made this argument in the 1890s. In fact, it was such a controversial case, they had to postpone the Supreme Court argument until after the elections, since the argument by the government would have disenfranchised so many voters. So Wong Kim Ark took his case to the Supreme Court, and he won, and he definitively established the principle that I think was clear from the 14th Amendment anyway, which is that everyone born on US soil is a US citizen. But moving forward to the time period that we're focusing on here today, despite these questions being resolved supposedly in Wong Kim Ark's case, the United States has continued to challenge the citizenship of both immigrants who naturalize and also their children. So we see during World War II that our country went to war with Germany, Italy, and Japan after the Pearl Harbor attacks in late 1941. And living in the United States, a very small percentage of the population were Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans. Those who had been born from those immigrants on US soil, they were automatically birthright citizens. And yet the US government and much of the US public decided that they were disloyal and could not be trusted based on absolutely no evidence. In fact, investigations by the government demonstrated their loyalty. And the government established 10 prison camps throughout the United States in which these individuals would be held. And here you see an image of one of these camps, and you see that they're very much prisons. They have been referred to as internment camps, but I think the proper word is prison camp. There were armed guards guarding these camps, and they were held behind barbed wire. And there was no choice. They had to move, they had to leave their homes and go to these prison camps. 10 camps throughout the United States, as can be seen on a slide with a map that shows the locations, including Minidoka, which is in Idaho, where I know many people are listening from today. And here you can see an overview, an aerial view of the Minidoka camp. So Japanese Americans, people who were US citizens but of Japanese ancestry, about 70,000, along with their Japanese immigrant parents, were rounded up and forced to live in these places because they were not viewed as Americans. And so we see that same theme and that similarity between Dr. Gruner's research and my own here.
So the history that you both just laid out reminds me of the removal of American Indians that took place 100 years before our time period in the 1830s. And that was when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. And that act called for the removal of all people that were indigenous to the lands east of the Mississippi to be removed to foreign lands west of the Mississippi, first in what is today Western Arkansas, and later in what would become Oklahoma. And my people, the Cherokees, were caught up in that policy, which led to the Trail of Tears, wherein approximately a third of the entire tribe died along the way. And although the Cherokee story is probably the best known in our broader culture, dozens of other tribes and thousands of people went on their own Trail of Tears during this era. It also makes me think about people that are indigenous to the lands along the United States borders, right here in Idaho, and also over in right here in Idaho, we have one of the 7 bands of the Kootenai Nation. Over in eastern Washington, we have the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. But the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, their historical territory spanned what is today Idaho, Montana, and British Columbia, but their lands and kin were bifurcated by the imposition of an artificial border between the United States and Canada. And 5 of those bands of the Kootenai Nation still live in Canada, and tribal members of the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho continue to have strong relations with those bands and with the land in British Columbia. However, their kinship relations and traditional practices have been significantly inhibited by this artificial political boundary that was not of their making. These hardships exist all along the United States' borders, and in particular along the northern and southern borders. And they're a product of a federal policy that simultaneously imposes citizen on some, but not all, of these people. And but they also fail to legally recognize that these folks all belong to a single body politic and ought to be able to freely assemble throughout their own lands. And so similarly, you both work on topics that at first glance seem different and unrelated, but with a closer and more nuanced look, it is clear that there are many issues within these 2 unique fields and different histories that actually allow us to discuss how both countries understood citizenship, who qualifies as a citizen. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work and how it addresses the histories under discussion today, starting with Dr. Frost?
Yeah, so I think in the United States, we've been a bit schizophrenic. We call ourselves, rightly so, a nation of immigrants. We celebrate our diversity and our multiculturalism, and there's truth to that. The United States has taken more immigrants than any other country, and many times we have welcomed immigrants in ways that other countries have not. So as I said, there's truth to that. But at the same time, I think we go through cycles of refusing to accept or acknowledge that immigrants who naturalize and their children are US citizens and are entitled to all the same rights and protections as US citizens who've lived here for generations. And we question who is a real American. So during the period we're discussing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we first saw Japanese imprisonment, as I've just described. We've also had racial barriers to naturalization that remained in place, starting from the very beginning of US history, and remained in place until 1952. So we've struggled in our question about who can be an American and who is a real American. And in fact, US policies inspired Nazi lawyers in the 1930s who cited US Jim Crow laws, who cited those racial barriers to naturalization, who cited laws barring marriage between whites and other races as support for things like the Nuremberg laws that Dr. Gruner has been discussing. And so this reminds me of a quote by an American legal scholar, Alexander Bickel, who said, "It's always easier to declare someone a non-citizen than to declare someone a non-person." I think we see that going on in the United States as well as Germany during this period.
Thank you. Dr. Gruner?
Yeah, Germany was much more blunt in this regard. It was always saying we are a non-immigrant society, and this is true before the Nazis came to power, and then also after the Nazis were defeated. And only kind of more recently changed in the public minds when the Syrian war kind of really raised the question how the Germans would react to the Syrian refugees. So there's a long history here, and the history is often very similar to what happened in the United States. So even before the Nazis came to power, Germany, for example, in their colonies prohibited intermarriage with indigenous women. And after 1933, we have to talk not only about laws which are enacted, for example, against the Jews, but really how groups within the society, and mainly the Jews, are deprived of their rights via, for example, in practical terms. And this started right away in 1933 with street terror against political and racial enemies. This photo illustrates an interesting case where we see Michael Siegel, who was a prominent lawyer in Munich in Bavaria, and he was forced by stormtroopers. First they cut his trousers, and then they hanged around his neck this poster saying, "I will never complain at the police station anymore." The context was that he tried to get released a client of his who had been, whose store had been attacked during this notorious boycott against the Jews in April 1933. So the story of violence and even murder during these first weeks and months in Germany was one part how the Jewish population was deprived of their protection. Because in summer 1933, the German state enacted a decree which in a way absolved all people who committed murder during these first weeks, and mainly those against the Jews, because they were committed as an act of revolution. Later, we see that a lot of these kind of local anti-Jewish policies have also shown similarities to, for example, the Jim Crow laws and practices in the United States. Cities introduced a wave of anti-Jewish restrictions, for example, to access public facilities like libraries, theaters, swimming pools. And this is, again, taking away rights because all the Jewish population equally paid with their taxes for the establishment of these facilities. And we see here a very famous pool at the lakeside in Berlin with a sign that Jews are not allowed to enter this swimming pool. Interesting is here that these local practices were not like consistent or coordinated. They really originated from local initiatives of local mayors, city departments, sometimes also the Nazi Party. So here we have on the low level, kind of the local level, legal and social exclusion of Jews. Later, Jews in Nazi Germany were also deprived of their protection because during the November pogrom, you all have heard about Kristallnacht, where Jews were not only attacked physically, but also their property was destroyed and burned, businesses were attacked, Jewish institutions, and then finally also synagogues were destroyed across Germany. And here you see one synagogue in this very small village in Germany. And again, noticeable is here that this is not the kind of act of a small cohort of Nazi fanatics, but there are a lot of people enabling these violent attacks, these acts of intimidation by not intervening and letting it happen, or in many cases also joining in.
So as a follow-up to that question, can you each take a few minutes to introduce what groups we were talking about that were excluded and what was the rationale for their exclusion? And I'll start with Dr. Gruner on this one.
Yeah, so in Nazi Germany, practically all groups were vulnerable who were perceived by the Nazis as a threat. And this started with like groups like Catholics who were kind of suspected that they would more listen to the Pope in Rome than to Hitler in Germany. But more kind of physically threatened were especially political enemies, communists, but also prominent journalists and artists, all who kind of spoke up during the first weeks and months against the Nazi when they came to power. This included prominent Jews like Albert Einstein or the writer Leon Feuchtwanger. And when they fled Germany because of the violence and the threats the Nazis issued, then they were deprived of their citizenship. So when they were abroad, Germany stripped them of their citizenship in each individual case. And interestingly, they used against the Jews new laws which they enacted in 1933 against communist and so-called state enemies. But the most dangerous for kind of enemy for the Nazis was always the racial enemy. And they kind of pursued this conspiracy theory that the Jews would wanted to take over the world and dominate the world. And this propaganda poster here illustrates this very strikingly. In a way, for the Nazis, the Jews were not only behind communism, which would be more the obvious case, but also behind capitalism. And I already mentioned that the Nuremberg laws were depriving non-Aryans of their first-class citizenship. However, what this term non-Aryans includes is not only the Jewish population, but also Romani people and, for example, Black Germans. So everybody who was different and perceived as a non-Aryan was practically deprived of political and civil rights. And this really played out very quickly, for example, against the Romani people, when 1 year later, or 1 year after the Nuremberg laws were enacted, during the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936, Romani who lived in Berlin were deported to the outskirts and had to settle in a camp which was established for them so that they were out of the picture for example, American journalists or other people who visited the Olympic Games to see. And interesting is the Nazis looked not only against so-called racial enemies, but also they wanted to kind of strengthen their own race. And so what they did, they even attacked members of their own perceived group. And this is where we see an intersection of different groups who were ostracized and persecuted. So for example, we have a large group called the asocials. So these were people who were not perceived as mainstream Germans. This could be a prostitute, alcoholic, and so on, but also members of the LGBTQ community. And then one really important group were people with different abilities, which were then often kind of deprived of their rights. They were often subjected to sterilization, brought into concentration camps, and many of them murdered.
Dr. Frost?
Yeah, so I want to go back to talking about what I started to discuss in my answer to the last question, which was the imprisonment of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans during World War II. And this imprisonment was through executive order signed by President Roosevelt, supported by political leaders, and supported by much of the American public. There was hysteria and there was fear. Of course, our nation was at war with Japan, but we were also at war with Germany and Italy. And there was no suggestion that the United States lock up even immigrants who were not yet citizens of those countries who were living in the United States, and certainly not those of German heritage or Italian heritage living in the United States. So I want to tell the story here of Joseph Kurohara. He was born in the United States, born a US citizen. His parents were Japanese immigrants. And as you see here from this picture, he's dressed in military uniform. He was a veteran. He fought in World War I. He saw action in France. He fought on behalf of the United States. But like everyone else of Japanese ethnicity, US citizen or not, he was one of the people required to be sent to what they actually called a concentration camp. The US government referred to them that way. It was concentrating the Japanese population away from the Pacific coast and in the interior of the United States. He was sent to Camp Manzanar. And he was rightly furious, and he spoke up about this. And he said, my own government, who I fought for loyally, I'm a veteran of this nation's army, is treating me and all of us like we are aliens when we are Americans. He was very vocal about this. And towards the end of the war, the US government was faced with a problem, which was it had this group of many US citizens or Japanese immigrants, 120,000 people in all, who were in these camps, and the war was almost over. It was going to have to let them back to their homes on the Pacific coast. But the government feared this. Their neighbors didn't want them back. And so Congress passed a law to make it easy for Japanese Americans to renounce their citizenship. And this was very coercive conditions. As I've described, they were in these prison camps under barbed wire with guns trained on them. They were very fearful what would happen when they left. And so Joseph Kurihara, like about 6,000 other Japanese Americans in prison during this time, gave up their citizenship. And Kurihara himself went to Japan and never returned to the United States. However, the vast majority of people who were coerced into giving up their citizenship later fought to get it back. And I have to say the story does have a happy ending because they fought together with several different lawyers, but in particular a man named Wayne Collins, who fought on their behalf in the US courts. And although it took well over a decade, the US government eventually gave back the citizenship of everyone who had been in a prison camp who had renounced their citizenship under this coercive law. And eventually the US government apologized to the Japanese Americans in these camps and paid reparations. And George H.W. Bush apologized on behalf of the nation. But I want to show you as well a slide of the situation for those who were in the United States as the war began, Japanese Americans who were running their businesses, living in their homes, and yet who were being questioned. Their loyalty was being questioned, their government feared them, their fellow citizens feared them. And this is what led them eventually to be imprisoned, and then some of them to renounce their citizenship under that coercive law I just described. So here we see the grocery store run by a Japanese American. He's actually a graduate of the University of California. And this is shortly after Pearl Harbor, when suspicion is high. And he puts this huge sign in his window that says, I am an American. He's trying to convince his fellow Americans he's as American as they are. But of course, like everyone else who was living on the Pacific coast of Japanese ancestry, the owner of this store was forced to go into one of those prison camps that I've described. Which we here see it pictured again. So this is an example of the United States falling prey to what Dr. Gruner described happening in Germany. And in fact, Secretary of War Stimson, in his diary, said, well, even if a Japanese person has lived in the United States for many generations, it's in their blood not to be loyal to the United States of America. So we see America making some of those same mistakes.
Wow. So we've been talking about both legal and social exclusion in different ways. What is the difference between a group that is socially ostracized and one that is legally expunged from a nation? Can you provide examples of when the local exclusion leads to legal changes or attempts at legal change, reaching the highest offices of the central government? Does one action depend on the other? How did those in policy positions, understand their role? And Dr. Frost.
Yeah, so I think the social exclusion is part and parcel of legal exclusion, and they can't be separated. So when we look, for example, I've talked today already about the situation for Chinese Americans like Wong Kim Ark. He and his family were forced to live in Chinatown. That was not just because that's where they wanted to live. They were excluded from other areas. They were forced into essentially a ghetto. Their children couldn't attend public schools. They were prohibited from doing that. And so we saw the same happen to Japanese Americans. They lived in social isolation. They lived apart from other citizens, in large part because of laws that prohibited where they could live, where they could send their children to school, where they could work, whether they could own property, and whether they could serve in government. So that, of course, led to that ability of US citizens who didn't recognize Japanese Americans as fellow citizens and instead feared them because they didn't know them, because they were isolated from them. So we see that social exclusion then allow for the legal exclusion, for the policymakers, the politicians to decide, all right, we're going to imprison this population because we hear public support for it. And that's where we also don't see political leaders responding to political pressure because frankly, there wasn't any. There wasn't Japanese immigrants who had arrived on our soil, could not naturalize at that time, so they couldn't vote. And they didn't have the kind of political power at that time to make their voice heard. So we see a really close connection between that social exclusion, the political exclusion, and eventually the kinds of atrocities that we saw, that we of course saw in Nazi Germany, but also the shameful imprisonment of Japanese Americans that we saw in the United States.
Dr. Gruner?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Frost here. One can't really separate social ostracizing and social exclusion and legal exclusion. They are intertwined. Sometimes social exclusion provides the ground for legal exclusion, and sometimes legal exclusion in a way creates social exclusion. And to illustrate this, one can really observe these two ways in Nazi Germany after 1933, where when we talk about these local practices, what I already mentioned, that city governments, municipalities enacted on the local level measures against the Jews. And here we see one, for example, in this picture, where a city government put at the outskirts of the town the sign that Jews are not welcomed in this place. And some of these practices were picked up by the Nazi government and kind of in a way transformed into law. And we can see one example for this kind of development when we think about the exclusion of Jewish patients from public hospitals. So first we have in various cities in Germany the initiatives to, in different ways, exclude Jewish patients from municipal hospitals, either not to accept them as patients, to segregate them within the hospital, and so on. And looking at these policies, then the Ministry of Interior of Germany decided in June 1938 to make this a national policy and introduced a decree which prohibited to admit Jews as patients in public hospitals across the country, except in emergency cases. On the other hand, we have the different development, for example, when we think about a law which is not so well known, which was enacted in April 1939 after Kristallnacht, which deprived Jewish tenants of their rights, of their kind of rental rights. So this was used by city governments. This law, which was a national law, was then used by city governments to segregate Jews in certain apartment buildings. And here we see a very inconsistent policy. So it really depended on the initiative of the people in these administrations if they would kind of take advantage of this law, as for example the town Dresden did in 1939 to create the first Jews houses, or if they would kind of lag behind, were not really initiative, and it took them 2 or 3 years longer to actually enact this policy, like Hanover in 1941.
Thank you. So I want to close this portion of our discussion by thinking about the role of the quote unquote ordinary citizen in policing or regulating national unity in each context. How do the legal categories that we've been talking about support exclusion, vigilantism, and creating social norms of othering? And I'll go back to Dr. Gruner to start us off.
Yeah, this is in a way a segue from what I just talked about. So what we can see, this mutual radicalization from the ground, but also from the top, points to the role of citizens on all these different levels. And we have to see that people on the ground, they sometimes assumed kind of what might government policy be in the future. So they anticipated things which were not enacted yet or not even drafted yet. And otherwise, on the other hand, people in, let's say, government functions would also be initiative to kind of draft laws, provide them, for example, to the Nazi leadership and say, this is what how we could exclude the Jews. So you have a really responsibility of individual people in all of these different institutions. And one has to really think about, normally our assumption is most of the policies were driven by fanatic Nazis. But this was actually not the case. It was a lot of different people who were often interested in excluding Jews for very different motives. It could be personal gain, messages of loyalty to the state, institutional benefit, but certainly also anti-Semitism. So this was a very complex kind of set of motivations. But what one can see here is, if you think about the participation of the general population, then I think we have to go even further than just to think about people who drafted measures or enacted these measures or enforced these measures. When think back at the picture of the swimming pool, the whole line of people who wanted to get tickets for the swimming pool, they all saw the sign which prohibited part of their fellow citizens from entering this pool. So if one makes the decision for oneself to enter the pool and enjoy the day, one is not only complicit, one can ask if this is not also already part of the perpetration. So I think we have to really think about the individual responsibility, not just for actual measures, but also for participation, enabling. And I think this is really a lesson which goes way beyond like Nazi Germany, that when we see the tiniest fractions of deprivation of civil rights, political rights of a certain group or even individuals, that one have to immediately step up and fight actively against it.
Thank you, Dr. Gruner. Dr. Frost.
Yes, and I agree fully with Dr. Gruner. And I want to say that in the United States, as mentioned before, that we're a bit of a schizophrenic country, but some of that schizophrenia comes from the fact that we sometimes our best selves are battling our worst selves. And I'm happy to say in a lot of the stories I've shared today, our best selves prevailed. So we started with Dred Scott, our nation's worst example of our problematic history with slavery. But we saw in the end of the day that not even a little more than a decade later, we as a country ended slavery and put in place the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship to hopefully end caste in America. And then I talked about Wong Kim Ark, the child of Chinese immigrants. And there was very strong anti-Chinese animus at the time that his case went before the US Supreme Court, where his own government said, you are not an American, even though you're born on US soil, and despite the 14th Amendment. But he won his case with the help of his fellow US citizens who litigated on his behalf, and a majority of the US Supreme Court who voted in his favor and said, no, the children of immigrants are indeed Americans. And I talked about Ethel McKenzie, who was an example of all the women he married non-citizens who were lost their citizenship and were disenfranchised. And while she lost her Supreme Court case, the political power of women got women elected to Congress, and they ended that law once and for all in the early 1930s. So that takes me to the imprisonment of Japanese Americans. And what's interesting here is I think, in a way, Nazi Germany showed us ourselves, held up a mirror to ourselves. Because even as we as a nation during that war were criticizing Nazi Germany for what it was doing, we were horrified by what Germany was doing. At the same time, we were a virulently racist nation, and we are a nation that had locked up a group of people solely based on their race. So I think that shameful episode, in a way, didn't go any further than it did, because we could see what was going on in Nazi Germany, and we didn't want to follow suit. So I will say that the ending to the Japanese imprisonment was, of course, returning citizenship to those who've been coerced into renouncing it. And that was through the hard-fought legal battles fought by people that were committed to helping Japanese Americans and the Japanese Americans themselves who fought for themselves very effectively. And then that takes us to 1980s, when as a country, we apologized for Japanese imprisonment and paid reparations, acknowledging that legal wrong. So I do think that there are good examples in our nation's history of people defending and supporting their fellow Americans and saying, no, you are an American just like I am.
Oh, thank you. So as I reflected on this question, it made me think about the role that ordinary people played in the colonization of this country, the United States. Although the federal government set the policies that led to the colonization of the United States, those policies were driven by land-hungry Euro-American settlers. And unfortunately, that dispossession is perpetrated to this day through legal proceedings limiting tribal water rights, tribal subsistence rights, diminishing native spiritual rights through things like the proposed land transfer at Oak Flat in Arizona, the unilateral imposition of dangerous infrastructure adjacent to lands important to tribes, things like the Dakota Access Pipeline. However, throughout history, and I think that both Dr. Gruner and Dr. Frost alluded to this as well, there have also been individuals that have stood up and said, enough is enough, no more. And these folks recognized in the case of the history that I study, these folks recognized and honored the incredible sacrifices that tribal people were forced to make. And although there was little to be done to reverse the colonization that had already occurred, they worked hard to ensure that the United States at least honored its end of the treaties and agreements that provided legal sanction to the colonization of this country. They demanded the recognition of the unique rights enshrined in these agreements, specifically for tribal citizens. And just as important, they worked to protect the homelands guaranteed so that tribal people could continue to live in their own way and according to their own rules and customs. And it's these people that I believe we should be celebrating and emulating as we reflect on our own ways of being in the tumultuous environment that we find ourselves in today. Knowledge, history, and advocacy are all intertwined in that effort, I believe. Indeed, as we've recently witnessed, advocacy without context leads to chaos, but we've also seen that knowledge without action can lead to similarly destructive ends. And so I think our call to action, all of us in this discussion today, is to learn deeply and to educate ourselves on the history and context of not only our own communities, but those other communities that find themselves in similarly perilous positions. I don't believe our duty is done there, however. From there, we must advocate. Like the Holocaust Memorial Museum itself, we must, quote, inspire citizens and leaders to confront hatred, prevent genocide, and promote human dignity in our constantly changing world. That effort, I believe, can be large or small, and we're all going to have to do that in our own way. The size of the impact is immaterial. What matters is our action. And in doing so, we honor our ancestors, and we become the ancestors to whom our descendants give thanks.